You can't talk about class in America without addressing race. Not that people don't try. The legacy of wealth inequality between blacks and whites goes way back, and most of it was by design. So here to discuss it is Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and creator of the 1619 Project, Nikole Hannah-Jones. Welcome, Nikole.
Thank you for having me on.
Yes, absolutely. We couldn't have this discussion without somebody like you. We've been talking about the vanishing middle class earlier, and you've written a lot about this extensively in the 1619 Project in regards to race especially, and there's that term, the racial wealth gap. Can you explain that for everybody? Tell us what it is, and let's also explore how bad is it right now?
The wealth gap is the difference in wealth between the typical white household or white family and the typical black household or black family.
Right.
So this is, of course, distinct from income. Income is what you get in your paycheck every week, but wealth is kind of all of your assets and tends to be handed down over time. Most of us don't accumulate all of our wealth by ourselves. It is passed down through generations. And what we know is that the wealth gap between black and white Americans exists at every level of income. Poor white people have more wealth than middle-class black people.
Damn those poor white people.
That gap, right, it's not saying that they don't struggle, but
right,
they
exactly.
do have more, so they're poor because of their income. But when you look at actually the assets that they have, they actually have more wealth than even middle-class black people. So today, the average black household with children has just 1 cent of wealth for every $1 that the average white household with children has. And that has remained unchanged for 70 years.
Wait, 1 cent for every dollar? That's the comparison? And it's been the same for 70 years? Why has there not been any movement in that at all?
Well, I mean, we haven't seen a lot of movement around income inequality in general. So we also know that we have about as much income inequality in general today as we did since the Great Depression or during the Great Depression.
Wow.
But when it comes to Black Americans in particular, we haven't had social policies that deal with the distinct disadvantage that Black Americans face.
And then there were government programs that didn't necessarily help blacks, like the GI Bill. The white people at the time coming out of the war had this assistance, but a lot of blacks were excluded from the GI Bill. Is that right?
Yeah, didn't necessarily help is a nice way of putting it.
Yeah, I was being generous with my look at that.
Yeah, often these programs explicitly discriminated against Black Americans.
Right.
So what we don't often realize is the GI Bill was a federal program, but it was locally administered. And so that meant that local white officials who had prejudice could decide who they were going to give these loans to and what they would allow people to use them for. And so we saw that there were prohibitions on Black GIs using those funds to buy into all white suburbs or to buy into all white communities, or being denied the ability to use them to purchase housing whatsoever. And what's so kind of pernicious and disgusting about the discrimination of the GI Bill is these are men who served their country.
That's right.
These are women who served their country. And the thank you for that was to come home and face more discrimination.
Yeah, it's really, pernicious is definitely the right word. And these programs, of course, are in the past. I'm using quotation marks. But what about programs like UBI? Do you think those type of universal programs can help with the wealth gap, or are they just more designed to just help people have some money?
Yeah, so universal basic income will help with income.
Okay.
So it will help you to pay your bills, but it will not help you to accumulate wealth. And wealth matters, right? Because if I have a job, I can pay my bills every week. But let's say my car breaks down, or let's say I get sick and I miss work. Wealth is what allows you to keep paying your bills when you don't have income. So providing people a basic income will certainly help. And I actually strongly support universal programs, livable wage, UBI, universal health care, but they will not close the racial wealth gap.
And this issue of the wealth gap, one of the reasons I'm interested in it, because it is about mobility. I'm a little suspicious of government programs designed to kind of just give us enough, as opposed to allowing us to participate freely in this capitalist system. Do you have a take on that?
Yeah, so what we know is that everything that Black Americans are told they have to do to close the wealth gap will not close 350 years of legalized economic plundering.
Yes.
Right? So we know Black people who with a college degree have less wealth than white people without a college degree. Black people who are married have less wealth than a white single mom. Black people who have bought a house have less wealth than white Americans who have also bought houses. So all of these programs are good because we should offer a basic standard of living for all American citizens. But, This wealth gap was created through explicit racial policy. And now that we can't create racial policy that benefits white Americans, now we don't want any racial policy at all.
Right, nothing.
Right, racial policy is bad, even if it's actually trying to address the harm of generational discrimination.
Well, let's talk about reparations, because
that's where we're going. That's where we're heading.
I think so, because, it seemed like a radical idea just a few years ago, giving win to something like reparations. Is it North Carolina? I think Asheville just passed it. They're not giving out cash, but instead funding for like home ownership and Black-owned businesses. Do you think this is a good idea, or should Blacks hold out until like cash is on the table?
Well, I think any reparations policy that is not about paying cash to close the racial wealth gap to individual descendants of enslaved people is not going far enough.
Okay.
Now, that doesn't mean you reject other reparations programs, but simply putting resources into a community actually probably will drive gentrification. It will probably see similar results as the opportunity zones, where federal government is putting money into low-income neighborhoods, but the only people getting those are rich people who don't live in the low-income neighborhoods. So I think you have to have much more targeted policy.
Yeah, and I think people should get out of talking about reparations as a personal thing. Like people say, well, I didn't own slaves. My family didn't own them. Well, it's not about you. It's about the American government making restitution, not Joe Blow, the plumber. We don't give a blank about you. This is the American government.
Right.
And I think it should be talked about not just in financial terms, but I think this is a moral obligation to right this wrong.
It is totally a moral obligation. Yeah. And look, Joe Blow the plumber also didn't sign the Declaration of Independence.
Yes,
and
right.
yet, he wants to claim that part.
We know
right?
of.
Like
right.
he wants that I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
Right. So you don't get to pick and choose which parts of the American legacy that you will accept and that you will own, and which parts you want to reject. So we want to accept the parts of this history that glorify us. Then we want to reject the parts like restitution for slavery, because I didn't have anything to do with that. This is actually a good thing for all of Americans. And you're 100% right. It is a moral obligation. We enslaved people and deprived an entire race of people from the ability to profit from their own labor, to own property, to be able to build any wealth. Black Americans entered freedom as the only people in the history of this country who had zero wealth as a people.
Yeah.
How can we move on if we don't acknowledge what was done? And in this country, in a capitalist country, acknowledgement has to come with financial restitution.
Yeah, and the acknowledgement is part of the history too, because, there's a slavery acknowledgement, because you certainly can't ignore that. But there's a post-slavery non-acknowledgement of history that has been erased and scrubbed over, and that's the Reconstruction era, when a lot of programs were being started, including a lot of civil rights programs, where Blacks could have built lives and things like that. And they were wiped out in pretty much a generation, right?
Yes, so we don't learn a lot about Reconstruction because it shows that we had a choice, and that we had started to actually create the multiracial democracy of our founding ideals. And then we got tired of it after 12 years.
Yes, we were exhausted. White people were like, this is exhausting.
This is enough.
Why do we have to help these Black people? You're not slaves anymore.
Right. The fact that they were saying get over slavery like 10 years after slavery, I think speaks to what the problem is.
They were the ones that couldn't get over slavery, by the way.
They're the ones who still can't get over slavery.
Right.
Like, holding on to slavery has not benefited Black people for one day. Nobody wants to get over slavery more than we do. But you can't just get over it by ignoring the costs and the harms, and by not doing anything to actually address those disparities. It's not incidental that in everything that you measure in America, the two groups of people who are on the bottom are the two groups of people who didn't choose to be part of America, which are Indigenous people and Black Americans.
Right.
You can't ignore the truth about that. There's a reason.
Yeah. One last thought on reparations. If reparations really becomes a national reality, how many more Rachel Dolezals do you think we'll see? Because I think people are going to be coming out of the woodwork to claim they're right. Are we going to have to do the paper bag test? Are you going to be okay with that?
Well, I would definitely fail the paper bag test. I'm going to go with no.
I think I could fail it too. All right, let's leave it there. We don't want to go to the paper bag test.